Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to another episode of In Defense of, where I, your host, Ryan the Indie Nerd, go and try to defend a controversial or hated part of wrestling, whether it is a gimmick, a person, a wrestler, a match, or something in the world of wrestling. Now, last week's episode, we talked a little bit about intergender wrestling, and again, today's episode, we're going to talk again about another thing that goes on in a lot of different promotions, and those are pay-per-views. Now, I'm not going to defend pay-per-views because I think everybody thinks that pay-per-views are something good, or network specials, depending on what company you really follow the most. Instead, what I'm going to do is going to defend less pay-per-views per year. Not just less complicated pay-per-views or less gimmicky pay-per-views. I've already covered gimmick pay-per-views in the past. This one is going to be less pay-per-views per year, and I'm specifically looking at WWE, because most other companies at this point, at least major companies, have been lowering the amount of pay-per-views or network specials or just special events. Now, this is not pay-per-views are not including the G1, obviously, in New Japan, or Best of Super Juniors, because that takes up a lot of the time during the year, these different tournaments that New Japan has. Instead, it's just strictly pay-per-views and network specials in WWE's case. It feels like an oversaturation of the market. It feels as if you're expected to watch almost between 15 to 20 hours of wrestling per week if you're a diehard WWE fan. If you're watching Raw, SmackDown, 205 Live, NXT, NXT UK, plus pay-per-view or network special on a weekend, or if it's a big 4 or 5 pay-per-view, also including an NXT takeover as well. And this can really drain the average wrestling fan, especially if an event underperforms or multiple events underperform. It will start to drag, it will start to really make things worse for the average wrestling fan. You're seeing it in more and more companies where the amount of special events that they do, the amount of special pay-per-views, network specials, has been decreasing per year. I believe this year New Japan is only running 3 pay-per-views: Wrestle Kingdom, Dominion, and the G1 Supercard was their other one. The co-branded one with ROH. TNA is running a total of 5 pay-per-views this year. 5. You can count them on a single hand. When it comes to WWE, not including NXT and NXT UK, you have Royal Rumble, you have Elimination Chamber, you have Fastlane, you have WrestleMania, you have Extreme Rules. I'm not going in order at this point. You have Backlash. You had Super Showdown. You had Stomping Grounds. You have SummerSlam. Most likely a second Saudi show at the end of towards the end of the year. You're gonna have Survivor Series, Money in the Bank, Backlash. Oh no, Backlash was Stomping Grounds this year. You see where I'm getting at, right? That's over 12 pay-per-views already. That's not include. I didn't even include a September pay-per-view, or an October pay-per-view, or whatever December's pay-per-view is going to be. The fact that WWE feels the need that they need to have once a month, sometimes twice a month, events is killing the will for an average wrestling fan to follow the product on a weekly basis. And what I'm trying to say here is, if you're an average wrestling fan and you know that Baron Corbin and Seth Rollins are feuding for the world title, and you know that there's a wrestling show or wrestling pay-per-view in 2 weeks, well, you know that that's going to be going towards till then. But if you then realize that there's another one in 3 weeks, you're not really going to be as inclined to watch what's going on, especially if it's a B show pay-per-view such as Stomping Grounds, such as Super Showdown over in Saudi Arabia, such as any of the plethora of B shows throughout the year, because there's not spaced out like every other promotion is. Now, with that being said, if you look at any other promotion, any other business or company, they have spaced out their programming, their pay-per-view schedules to be more fan-centered. And what I'm talking about here is the idea that fans want to watch either for wrestling, the storylines, the wrestlers, or all three, right? Or any combination of them all. If WWE just even goes as far as looking to Florida, looking at NXT, they space all their shows out so perfectly that they are able to build proper storylines that you can follow very simply. They don't feel rushed. And you can watch an episode of NXT, which is about 1 hour per week, and you can watch that each individual episode, one after the next, each week, and you can feel that everything's going forward properly. It's going at a good speed. It's not the same storyline every single week on maybe 1 or 2 shows per week like WWE has been doing. You're not going to have something going and overarching a 3-hour episode overall, then maybe getting segued into SmackDown, which is another 2 hours, just to lead into a pay-per-view that isn't going to be the culmination of a feud like it used to be, or try to further the feud along. A lot of times it just feels like another basic match that could have been put on Raw or SmackDown. When it comes to NXT, the guys and girls in NXT try to put on a more story-centered match where you're going to be invested in that feud for 2 to 3 months, because you have to wait for the culmination of each feud for 2 to 3 months, whenever the next takeover is. In New Japan, you have the ability to really tell stories through the different tournaments and the finals of those tournaments to lead up to a major show, such as Wrestle Kingdom, such as Dominion. Alright? You know who's going to be main eventing the Wrestle Kingdom, their WrestleMania, by the end of August. Winner of the G1 ends up main eventing Wrestle Kingdom, unless they lose their briefcase or there's some backstage politics. But for the most part, it's almost every year the winner of the G1 is in the main event. And between August and January, you get to see through their matches, through their storytelling, whenever they do have shows. You get to build up the story progression for multiple months, and that's what effective programming is for. You don't want to bore your fan base and make them feel like, okay, well, I can skip this pay-per-view or this special because there's another one in 2 weeks, and they're already advertising a certain match, so obviously they're not going to change this title, or they're not going to end this feud, so I can skip this one. I know that I have skipped out on certain shows because I feel like I don't need to watch it because there's another show scheduled in a week or two. I know last year after the Greatest Royal Rumble, which I still have not watched because I don't support the WWE's relationship with Saudi Arabia, but that's for another time. I knew that a lot of the matches weren't going to have definitive finishes or definitive storyline endings because Backlash was a week or two later, and they were already advertising matches that were already going on in Saudi Arabia, and they had made those matches first because the Saudi Arabia show kind of came out of nowhere originally. So you weren't going to, it didn't feel like it was going to matter as much as if you had spaced it out more. Now, another reason that I think that pay-per-views should be, the amount of pay-per-views should be lowered in WWE is because you're seeing more and more people venture out to other promotions. You're seeing people who are just wrestling fans who are looking for something different. They want to see how other promotions are doing it. Now, I'm not saying every single wrestling fan is going to watch New Japan or every Ring of Honor show or Impact, but you don't need that as long as people are trying to look at for something different. You know that maybe your product isn't doing as well as it used to. You can just look at the ratings and the amount of people watching each episode of Raw and SmackDown compared to what they were a year ago, or 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. The number of people who are watching the weekly programming is less and less. One, because the storylines feel rushed. There's not any great overarching storyline going on that has people compelled to watch on a weekly basis. But also, you can easily get filled in on what's going on by the time the next pay-per-view comes around, because it feels like it's just a same old. You get one feud going for 2 or 3 pay-per-views. You get the occasional feud that only lasts one pay-per-view, or you get one that is a start-stop kind of thing. You had, for example, Seth Rollins and Brock Lesnar. You had that going from from Royal Rumble to Mania. Every so often they'd interact on weekly television. You didn't get them in any other matches throughout that time. They stopped after Mania. Money in the Bank came. Brock gets the Money in the Bank. And then Extreme Rules, Brock cashes in. And now that feud's resumed again on a full-time basis. That's effective storytelling. You're trying to get people invested in a match. A non-successful booking or storyline, again involving Seth Rollins, is Seth Rollins versus Baron Corbin, where you saw every single week from WrestleMania to Extreme Rules, and still on weekly television, even though Seth doesn't even have the title anymore, they're still feuding. You don't need to watch those weekly programmings, and you don't even need to watch the B show of Extreme Rules or Stomping Ground, because both matches pretty much ended the same way. Everybody got involved. Lacey, Baron, Becky, Seth. And it was a slower match both times, both pay-per-view times. The only difference is that Brock Lesnar cashed in at Extreme Rules. But the idea of you having to watch so many hours of television to see what's going to happen in this pay-per-view, you don't need to do that anymore. People have decided you can read the spoilers online throughout. You can have people live tweet it and follow along just through there, seeing the highlights that WWE posts on their social media during the events, as well as throughout the week. You can just hit the highlights without watching those 3 hours, 2 hours of their weekly programming. You can also realize that, okay, well, this guy just got this title. Somebody is reporting that they're already booking and advertising for the pay-per-view in 2 months that this match is going to happen again. So why watch this secondary pay-per-view? I do feel like I'm repeating a lot, certain things like the advertising and the basic storylines, but it's mainly to try to push that idea forward. It's not so much, more wrestling is not a bad thing, as long as the more wrestling you have is actually fluid, it's actually interesting night in, night out. With Paul Heyman and Eric Bischoff taking over the different brands, I feel like more people have decided to say, okay, well, let me look and see if this is actually going to be interesting. But that doesn't change everything. Everybody's ideas on what the pay-per-views are going to be like when you're still keeping the same pay-per-view format. Again, less is more when it comes to the pay-per-views. You can define storylines much better. You don't have to have the same matches on a weekly basis to lead up to a pay-per-view. You can have shenanigans going on. You can lower the hours of Raw and still get the same amount of storylines through to lead up to your pay-per-view. And again, every other promotion, for the most part, knows how to get that ideas done. Every other promotion, for the most part, knows that we don't need to have a pay-per-view every single month. Instead, we can space them out throughout the year and just have effective storytelling come first and effective matches on our hour or two programming throughout the weeks leading up to an event, and it will get the people invested the exact same way, if not even more, than if you are watching WWE programming. Now that does it for another episode of In Defense Of. Leave your comments below. Make sure that you follow us and subscribe to us here on YouTube at Deep Six Wrestling. Make sure that you follow us on our social medias, on Facebook at Deep Six Wrestling, as well as on Twitter at Deep Six Wrestling. DM us, message us on YouTube, message us on Facebook. Let me know what you would like to see on our next episode of In Defense Of. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.